N64 games on the PlayStation 2? Surely you can't be serious. Well, I am serious, and if you really want to, you can call me Shirley. But let's not get too excited about this because, well, let's just take a look at Daedalus 64 running on the PS2. And wow, this menu does look pretty good. It's even got box art. This can't be that bad if they've gone to all this trouble. Maybe. Let's start out with Mario 64. Ease into this. And yeah, okay, there's no sound, that is a concession we're going to have to make, and actually Peach's intro is now slightly less annoying, and it kind of looks okay so far, but this is where things start to go awry. Yeah, the frame rate is pretty good actually, but there's a few glitches, a slight problem with the geometry, and this is all captured from a real PS2 by the way, and the colours really are so blown out in this emulator, it's not just my TV or capture device. Anyway, let's try going into a level. Yeah, and I'm afraid things don't really get any better from here. Playable in the strictest sense of the word, but you wouldn't really want to. This is, though, a genuine N64 emulator, sort of running on the PlayStation 2. No disrespect to the developers here or the guy who brought this to the PS2, because this is very much a proof of concept port of the PSP N64 emulator Daedalus. And as a proof of concept, it does kind of work well enough to make it seem like this would be worth pursuing if anybody could be bothered. But the developer of this particular version does seem to have abandoned it, but I can hardly blame them. It's a huge project, and the world probably isn't really crying out for another N64 emulator, even if it is on the PS2. And yes, if Mario 64 isn't working that well, probably other games aren't going to fare much better, but let's give Wave Race a try. And yeah, pretty much more of the same, maybe slightly less messed up than Mario 64 actually. Well, it runs, but still only just. I did have high hopes for this. It wouldn't be completely out of the question to get N64 games playable on the PS2 like this. The PlayStation Portable version of this does work pretty well, and the GameCube could do pretty decent N64 emulation too. Systems with broadly similar levels of power as the PlayStation 2, and they did okay, but sadly this time out it's not to be. This is something I discovered whilst making the PlayStation 2 installment of my games that push the limits of videos, and whilst this isn't going to quite fit in there, I found it too interesting to just completely let it go, and it sent me off down a bit of a rabbit hole which I decided to spin off into its own video. So to make this video not totally clickbait, I can now show you one N64 game actually running really quite well on the PlayStation 2. It's Mario 64 once again, but this time quite a bit nicer. In fact, this version may run even better than the N64 original. This is absolutely not emulation though, but a native software port of Mario 64 to the PlayStation 2, based on the decompilation of this game that some very clever folks published on GitHub a couple of years ago, and it is fantastic. There's the occasional glitch, but not that many. Even the N64 version, of course, wasn't totally free of that sort of thing. But this is not just a recreation of the original game, it's actually improved with a higher resolution and a better frame rate. Running at 640 by 448 instead of the 320 by 240 of the original, and the frame rate does go up to 60 frames per second. It doesn't reach this most of the time, but it does a lot better than the 20 to 30 you'd see on the original console. In fact, it plays so darn well I've spent more time capturing footage for this than I really need to, but a classic is always a classic, and from what I've heard this is good through the whole game right to the end. And yeah, this is another thing which I could have put in the games that push the limits of the PS2 video, but whilst this really is impressive, it's maybe not in that sort of way. It's probably not really pushing the limits of the console. There's nothing in Mario 64, no trick that the N64 has really that the PS2 would struggle with. There's far more technically impressive games on the system than this, and that's no real surprise. The PS2 is from the next generation and is just so much more powerful, and this is just a game running on the PS2 with all its capabilities. No, what's impressive about this is the massive effort that's gone into reverse engineering Mario 64 to decompile it into the source code and rebuild it. If you're not familiar with programming, this might all seem a bit obscure, but the people behind the project have basically worked out the recipe for Mario 64, or at least a recipe. It's going to be different from what Nintendo have hidden away on their servers somewhere, but it does the same thing. A recipe that is stripped of copyrighted properties. You need to supply that yourself in the form of an original ROM file of the game, but if you have that and the know-how, you can compile the reverse engineered source code into a working version of this game on the N64, but also with a bit of modification, a totally different platform like the PS2. That itself not an easy task, so kudos to this guy whose tag seems to defy pronunciation. But going further down the rabbit hole, what other emulators are there on PS2? Is there anything else that pushes the system in this surprising direction? Well, would you believe that someone's ported RetroArch to the PlayStation 2? Yeah, the user interface isn't all that pretty, but it does do the job, so let's see it running some games. And we'll start out fairly simple, shall we? See how it handles Game Boy games. And yeah, it's not bad, certainly playable, and if you're not familiar with RetroArch, well, it's a graphical front end for a load of different retro game system emulators, both versions of existing emulators on other platforms, and in some cases ones written specially for RetroArch. It's got near enough every classic system you can think of and has been ported to loads of platforms, modern consoles and operating systems of course, and some older ones too, like the PS2. For 8-bit stuff, this version of RetroArch does do the job pretty well, NES games being no exception. There is an amazing 48 emulation cores currently available for the PS2 port, and that covers a lot of ground, not just retro emulators, but also stuff like PR Boom, the Doom source port. Yes, it runs Doom, of course, but sadly there's no PC Engine or TurboGrafx 16 support for some reason, unless I'm missing something, and there are a few duplicates. The Game Boy, for example, has several different emulators to choose from. And not all of it works without a hitch. Some emulators like Stella, the Atari 2600 emulator, just crashed for me no matter what I did. Maybe I'm doing something wrong, and others, even though they boot, are just too slow to be much fun. Mega Drive emulation or Genesis, as you can see, well, that does work pretty well enough to enjoy a nice game of Streets of Rage 2, even if it's got the occasional hiccup. The Super NES though, well, that's not so great. The PS2 just doesn't seem to be able to hack it here. There are some settings you can mess with to improve things a bit, but not enough to make games truly playable. This footage might not look too bad, but games just can't play at full speed, and it really is obvious when you're playing them. That is kind of a shame, and surely it means that anything more powerful than the Super NES is just not going to happen. You'd definitely think the Game Boy Advance would be totally out of the question, but actually no, Game Boy Advance emulation is pretty good. Not absolutely perfect, but extremely playable, and also a bit of a puzzle. If the PlayStation 2 struggled so much with the Super NES, well, how can it do this so well? Well, two things to keep in mind. Firstly, the Super NES is notoriously difficult to emulate properly. Truly accurate Super Nintendo emulation still requires a fairly powerful system, even by modern standards, one of the big stumbling blocks being the complex way it handles colour. Not stuff that the PS2 can't do, but getting it to recreate the exact way the Super NES did it requires a lot of calculations to be done. And also the emulation cores for RetroArch, the bit that does the actual emulating, they're written by different people at different times, originally for different machines, and some are just more efficient than others or more suited to a particular platform. The Game Boy Advance emulator in this version of RetroArch GB-SP was originally built for the PlayStation Portable, and if it works well there, it's probably going to be possible to port it to the PS2 as well. The Super NES emulator is a version of SNES 9X originally made for Windows, then apparently this version was optimised for ARM processors, which the PS2 doesn't have. Getting it working at all is impressive, getting it running smoothly might be out of the question, but that doesn't mean that the PS2 can't do Super NES emulation, because it can, and I'll show you that in a moment. In the main, RetroArch on the PlayStation 2 is pretty amazing, and whilst it still feels like a beta version, it's full of little problems. I'm astonished to see this on this platform. I don't know who really is responsible for this. There's very little info about this version online, and it seems to have been launched without much fanfare. It is, though, an official port of RetroArch. It's listed on their website, and someone has gone to a lot of trouble to get this working. And this is all very recent too. Why now? I don't know, but this is probably the weakest system anyone has attempted to port RetroArch to, so it must have been a challenge. And yes, this is not the best way to run this or any other emulator either. If you just want something that runs classic games, there's far better choices. Any remotely modern PC or laptop will be easier to set up and run games far better than this. Even the OG Xbox is a way better choice. But it's fun to mess around with if you like that sort of thing. Yes, indeed, playing Neo Geo Pocket games on the PS2. What a time to be alive. But as for Super NES emulation, there is another emulator, a standalone one, that does do pretty well, and that is the really sensibly named SNEStical. Yes, this is related to the similarly titled Nesticle, the pioneering emulator that played a big role in popularising the whole emulation thing in the first place way back in the 90s. This was developed by the same guy, Sardu, for the GameCube originally in the early 2000s, but released fairly recently along with the PS2 version after public interest. As you can see, this does run most games really well, including Super Mario World, F-Zero and Super Castlevania. Yes, a notable achievement. I mean, kind of pointless. If Super NES games are what you want, there's easier and better ways of doing it than this, of course, but it does run games amazingly well. Even more so after seeing SNES 9X under RetroArch get bogged down so much. What's the secret sauce here? Well, I don't know, but this was built with the PS2 in mind and optimised for that platform. I do notice that SNES 9X does support Super NES expansions like the Super FX chip, albeit slowly, whilst this won't run games like Star Fox at all, but that's perhaps the price you have to pay for speed. And there are other Super NES emulators on many consoles of this era, and they usually struggled pretty badly. I don't think the Dreamcast ever saw an emulator that ran games this well. Yes, it's very nicely done, but I don't think this is the most impressive emulation feat on the PS2. Not RetroArch or SNEStical, no, the emulator that pushed the limits of the PS2 the most was created by Sony themselves. Yeah, you might recognise this game. This is a PlayStation 1 emulation via the PlayStation 1 Portable Station, also known as POPS, a PS1 emulator for the PS2, and here we are playing Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And when this emulator works, it works really well. From this footage, you'd never tell if I was playing this on the original PlayStation 1 or whatever, but this is an emulator running completely in software. But surely this is completely pointless. The PlayStation 2 has PS1 support built into it. No need for an emulator, well, unless you want to download games from the internet and store them on the PS2's hard drive via the PS2 network adapter. I say games, but there was only ever one game officially available this way, Bishi Bashi Special 3, which users could download from the Konami channel on the Japan-only PS2 broadband navigator service. It seems like a strange solution, especially for just one game, and maybe they had others planned and dropped it when the service didn't take off. And Sony were already developing PS1 emulation for other platforms like the PSP, so it's not like they started from scratch. And no, there really is no other way of running PS1 games on the PS2 from a hard drive or a SD card or whatever, even up to the present time. But you might be wondering what the difference is here between something like this emulator and the Mario 64 conversion we saw earlier. Well, none of these games have been individually converted to run on the PS2, and emulator can potentially run any game, any software from one system on another, converting it in real time on the fly. And that's what the Pops emulator is doing here, having the PS2 pretend to be a PS1, and we've seen it handle a couple of 2D games. How about something a bit more challenging like the insane Pepsi Man? This has a lot of video in it, which I thought might be problematic because I'm running this from a USB stick, but it's fine and the video looks better than ever. It shouldn't be a huge surprise, as even the USB 1.1 ports that the PS2 has are way faster than the transfer rate of the PS1 CD-ROM drive, but you never can tell. And the 3D stuff is a-okay too, no speed issues at all. Now, given that the Super NES and Game Boy Advance emulation seem to be stressing the PS2 pretty hard already, how on earth can it emulate the PS1 at something much more powerful than either of those systems? Well, for a start, I should point out that even in its native PS1 compatibility mode, the PS2 is already partly using emulation. It does have the PlayStation 1's CPU and some other bits on board, so it doesn't need to emulate those, but the PlayStation's graphics processor though, that's not there, and the PlayStation 2 uses software emulation to make its own GPU function like the original PlayStation's. The only thing left to emulate is the PlayStation 1's CPU, and if you've got that working, well, there's nothing stopping you going all the way. In fact, later versions of the PlayStation 2, the slim models, got rid of even more of the PS1 hardware and relied on yet more emulation to fill the gaps. This did result in quite a lot of incompatible PS1 and even PS2 games on these models though, and that's something that this emulator suffers with too, like Ridge Racer Type 4 here. Yeah, it's pretty messed up. And yes, I know if I really want to play this game this way, there are fixes available. That's not quite the point I'm trying to make though, because this still runs at a good frame rate. It's not performance that's the problem, it's just that this emulator is a bit buggy. The reason it's able to do so well, the reason it can play games at this kind of frame rate is probably down to what's called high-level emulation. You don't necessarily need to perfectly emulate all the properties of a game system to run games, you just need to make something that does the same thing. You don't need to worry exactly how the GPU does its thing, you just need to make something that gives the same output, more or less, for the same input. And complex 3D based systems are more amenable to this type of emulation for a number of reasons, especially when you have good info about how they work, which whoever programmed this at Sony surely did. Though even then you're going to get some incompatibility like we do here. It's still amazing that this works so well though, probably pushing the PlayStation 2 just as hard as any actual PlayStation 2 game ever did, and it was done by Sony themselves and then basically hidden away. The fact that you can use it with any game other than Bishi Bashi Special 3 is down to a cleverly hacked loader by PS2 Cena Kraken. And if you really want to, you can use this to run not all but a good portion of PlayStation 1 games from a PlayStation 2 internal hard drive or USB drive via the softmod free McBoot. That is the thing that made all the stuff in this video possible on the original hardware. The setting it all up is a pain. I won't even attempt to cover the details here, but there are plenty of resources online if you do a bit of Googling. But in the end, the performance of Pops is why I was sort of hopeful that N64 emulation might work. A lot of the same stuff seemed to line up. It is based on a PSP emulator, it uses high-level emulation, but it needs a lot more work. On the other hand though, if you're looking for some visuals to accompany your breakcore to make a terrifying split from reality to video, then Zelda running on this thing will do nicely, though I suspect the type of people who make breakcore compilations don't watch this channel. So let's say goodbye to the PS2 for now, and yes, I am working on a proper games that push the limits of the PlayStation 2 video. This was just sort of an adjunct to that. I will be looking at normal PlayStation 2 games that push the limits soon enough, and no surprise that it may involve San Andreas. So thank you as always to my wonderful Patreons. Your help is, as ever, much appreciated, and anyone who would like to join them would definitely be most welcome. There is a link below. And I'll say thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.